Hello friends, I'm Rob here in the lair of OmnusI, and today I wanted to come out and talk about a subject that's a little bit controversial. It's getting less and less controversial as the subject fades into the rearview mirror of history, but I thought I'd like to touch on it. This has been inspired a bit by Ben from Puffin Forest in his video where he talked about his experiences with the subject. Now, I've talked a lot in all of these many videos I've made about role-playing games. A lot of them have been about Dungeons and Dragons. Makes sense. It's the game I came into the hobby with back in the Beck Me edition of Dungeons and Dragons. But I've played through Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, 3rd edition, 3.5 edition, 4th edition, and 5th edition. I've seen all of it. I'm just a little too young to have played original Dungeons & Dragons. There wasn't anybody around me when that came out to have a chance at that one. And I was too young anyhow. But realistically, I've played pretty much everything in Dungeons & Dragons. I've played classic modules, I've played derivative modules, I made up my own stuff. I understand Dungeons & Dragons pretty well. And if you know me at all, you know that I'm a pretty... I try not to be too judgmental. And in fact, I've gone on record and said that there's something I find that is good about all of the editions. I don't put an asterisk on that statement. Most people that I know of in the gaming hobby do, if they ever said anything like that. Because there's one edition that really gets a lot of hatred. If you go onto social media sites, especially ones focusing on Dungeons & Dragons, unless it's specifically around this particular edition, you're almost always going to find jokes made about it or disparaging comments made, because it really did cause some problems for a lot of people. Even if I didn't hate it, I still have to admit it's kind of an uncomfortable presence. But still, 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons is something that happened, and it was weird, to say the least. So I just thought I'd like to make a video, kind of creating a bit of disambiguation about, what I went through and what it really meant to me to have this 4th edition in the middle of the family of Dungeons & Dragons products. Now, of course, Wizards of the Coast had very successfully launched 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. Caught a lot of people's imagination, started a new renaissance of Dungeons & Dragons in a time when TSR was dead. Wizards of the Coast stepped in, revitalized Dungeons & Dragons, and with the open gaming license, they opened the floodgates for a massive amount of any gaming store's shelves to be Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeons & Dragons related. You had thrivings of companies like Green Ronin and Troll Lord Games and Mongoose and, a lot of these companies that were producing a lot of content for 3rd edition. That open gaming license was basically a green light. As long as you use our stuff and you acknowledge us, make what you want. And they did. Oh, they did. Almost to the point where the game was nearly unrecognizable unless you really, as a game master, took a hold, not just Dungeon Master, I'm talking Game Master. You took a hold of the game and limited what could be used in your game. There were some splat books that came out that were so obnoxiously overpowered and under-tested that I just put blanket bans on things from certain companies. I'm not going to get into the details or show my ban list or anything, but there were some that I just didn't want any part in. Some that were completely dominated with feats that at the top end got just broken. Fairly quickly, too. And of course, with 3rd edition, you really had the supremacy of the build monsters. People trying to find ways to break the game and break the game world consistently by pairing together races and classes and prestige classes and feats that would allow you to just do ridiculous things and completely shatter any semblance of balance in the game. Now, some people loved that period, that kind of a wildcat feeling that everything was possible, including some fairly horrible things, but anything was possible. Your greatest dreams could be made out into a game. And There's something intoxicating about that, but 3rd edition wasn't without its flaws as well, especially when you got into high-level play. When, your iterative attack started requiring you to go into higher and higher math, and you had lots of wang doodles and whatsits that added all these different bonuses, it got pretty hairy. Low level was still fun and fairly well balanced, just when you hit about, 5th level, which is a notorious level in Dungeons and Dragons. Once you hit that level, it really started to go all over. So, 3rd edition was a lot of fun, and we told some great stories with it. But by the end, it was starting to become pretty evident that it wasn't going to be much longer. First of all, they had created the 3.5 edition, because there was just some things in 3rd edition that needed fixing. Mostly, in my case, that was the most dramatic change was just a few spells that were out of bounds in terms of, for example, the heal spell that allowed you to heal all damage wasn't a big deal at all in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, because your characters almost never scraped 100 hit points. So fully healing you, great, easy enough to do. 3rd edition, however, where you never stopped rolling for hit points for every level, and you had different feats that could add on extra hit points on top of what your Constitution already gave you. Oh, and did we say Constitution? Because that could spike upwards of 20. Yeah, you could have characters that could get up to the 200 hit point range, and I've seen builds with higher. Just insane numbers. So the idea of a heal spell suddenly being able to heal 200 points of damage, yeah, that was kind of broken. The polymorph spell needed taming, and that's just a couple of examples. There were other changes that needed to be made throughout, and the 3.5 edition worked to address them. It couldn't, however, fix how broken the upper level of the game was. There's just simply too much stuff that was out there if you didn't have a really tight control on your game. And even if you did, some of the builds did let you get kind of silly. So I played 3rd edition, I ran 3rd edition primarily, but during that time I also was really playing a lot of other games. I was looking through other games because, again, the high-level play for a 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons really did turn me off. And my players weren't really keen on playing and only running up to like 5th and 6th level. They liked meaty campaigns. So I could deal, but towards the end of the campaigns, they would often start getting very haggard and tiresome. To cap it all off, too, Wizards of the Coast made internal changes that made it pretty clear they were thinking about going different directions when they cut ties with their magazine division, which really hurt because I loved Dragon Magazine. Even if in the 3rd edition era it had changed quite a bit, it had become more corporate, very cut and dried. Thanks to the professional aura that Paizo put onto it, it put in a very templated gloss to it. The art was excellent, something they maintained beyond their Dungeon and Dragon magazine roots, and they were laid out very formulaically. Some of the artistry from lead editors like Tim Kask and Roger Moore, not as much. But still, I mean, they were very readable, very serviceable. The writing quality was still quite good. And again, Dragon Magazine really served to crank out even more stuff into 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. So, I mean, I had the CD collection of the first 250 episodes of Dragon Magazine and read those. Fun reading, lots of personality and charm to them. As you started reading the Paizo-produced versions, they were very information-dense, and there was still some good writing in them. I'm not shorting them. I thought Paizo did a fine job, but lost some of their charm and appeal, but gave out a lot of game content. They also drifted away from some of the things about Dragon that used to be about, it wasn't just a house organ. Dragon really did celebrate a lot of other games, and at the very least, they reviewed a lot of other games that weren't Dungeons and Dragons related. That really kind of dried up, and it became almost exclusively a house organ for Dungeons and Dragons. But when Wizards of the Coast announced they were going to cut the print versions of Dragon and Dungeon and turned them into D&D Insider, an online platform, it was going to dovetail into 4th edition. They were coming up with this grand multimedia outlet for 4th edition that they'd been kind of teasing and then finally announced when they announced the 4th edition. The whole idea was they were going to have a virtual play area where you could do basically what you can do these days with Roll20, where you can lay out maps and move tokens around and play with other people. It was just going to be codified so that it all could be Dungeons and Dragons centric. And if you bought into 4th edition, hey, you were going to get all this stuff. It's going to be really cool. Well, that didn't happen, but we're not quite there yet. So at any rate, I was kind of approaching the winter of my discontent with 3.5 edition, 3rd edition. I have a lot of books for 3rd edition. I don't have all of them. I never pretended to. But I have a fair amount of all of the officially produced supplemental books for 3rd edition, and a couple of the other ones that I was interested in that didn't seem too broken. I don't have the Tome of Battle, the Book of Seven Swords. That one's notorious for being really, really broken. But I do have a couple that are, again, I really don't ever want to use. The Rokugan book had a couple of prestige classes, for instance, that were just flat out broken. Although, it was actually quite a bold step into another world, so it was pretty good. But 4th edition is coming. And eventually they announced it, and there was a lot of buzz. They put in a lot of advertising for it. They plugged a lot of 4th edition, trying to stir up a lot of interest. From what I'd heard, the community was pretty split. I think we all understood that a 4th edition was probably inevitable and might even be a good thing for those of us who were really kind of tiring of 3rd edition or 3.5 edition. It wasn't that it was bad. It just, again, kind of could wear on you after a while when you're playing beyond the first few levels. So it launched, and I was there on opening day, and I bought my slipcover and the 3 core books, including the Monster Manual here, and the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I sat down right there in the bookstore and I started reading it. It was beautiful. These books, great art. The art has never been a problem for Wizards of the Coast. They've always understood the value of really nice art. And a lot of the art in the core book really did have some of the flavoring of what you would already have seen in a lot of Paizo stuff, because they used a lot of that quality art. It's just really fine fantasy art. And they kept illustrating everything. All the monsters in the Monster Manual are illustrated. There's lots of artistic illustration and things that are illustrative of the content that's the written prose. So and the layout was excellent. Again, very easy to read, pick up, no problem. But it was pretty quickly clear that this was not any version of Dungeons and Dragons like we had imagined at all. The biggest thing, and the biggest criticism I hear about Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition is that they tried to turn it into World of Warcraft. That was the rallying cry against it. They've tried to attract the World of Warcraft crowd. And it's a valid criticism if you look at it. It has a lot of elements that might be familiar to a person who comes in from a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. It has 3 tiers of abilities. You have your at-will abilities that you will be using again and again and again. You have encounter abilities that you can use once in an encounter, but after the battle is over, it comes back so you can use it in the next one. And they are usually a significant chunk bigger and more impressive than your at-will encounters. And then you have your daily power. It is the capstone ability that you have, and it's usually something very impressive. It does the most damage, for instance, or it has some significant debilitative effect on an enemy, and almost all of these are combat related. There's next to nothing in 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons that relates to anything outside of combat. This was a red flag a little bit, but reading through it, I was determined. I mean, Wizards of the Coast was supporting it. This is going to be the edition we're going to have for probably 10, 15 years. So you better understand what they're selling. So I read through the Player's Handbook. I was a little surprised, to say the least, to find like the magical item listing in the Player's Handbook. Why? Because magical items aren't treasure anymore. It's expected gear improvement. Just like in World of Warcraft. Yeah, that comparison comes up quite a bit. You are iteratively trying to improve all the gear for all the different slots of your body, and if you wanted to carve it from common to uncommon to rare to epic to legendary, it actually, that makes sense for how they divided up all of the gear. Boy, does it ever. And your armor has magical bonuses, and you can make them out of different exotic materials, which adds different bonuses. And yeah, it does fit. And there's quite obvious builds that certain stuff gives you the best benefit. So you're going to be working towards the best stuff, and getting a complete suit of the best stuff will cap your character off at the effectiveness of a particular level. Most people can understand that. It's not just people who play, World of Warcraft or other online games, but the artificial formulas to this makes it very much less of an organic thing and very much just a grid and a graph role-playing game. It's just by numbers. Boom, boom, boom. Valid argument. I can't fault that argument. Everybody knew at some point when you were playing Dungeons & Dragons that all the treasure is on a table, and you had certain things very quickly. You learned that things that you'd be like, oh, wouldn't it be great if my fighter has gauntlets of ogre power? And then a little while later, maybe you find gauntlets of ogre power, and then you're like, gosh, I wish I had a girdle of fire giant strength. And if you somehow get a girdle of fire giant strength and you're just ripping through things, and then you're like, oh, I wish I had a girdle of storm giant strength, and you're absolutely destroying. D&D has always had some of that to some extent, but it was really obvious in 4th edition. There's no masking it. It is absolutely a collect fest, just like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, oddly enough. So there's validity to people saying that this was designed to appeal to a certain group. But I think it kind of transcends that. It's one of the great appeals of role-playing games is for your characters to constantly be evolving and improving. And improving gear is a lot easier than improving other stuff. But don't worry, that other stuff gets improved too, because every time you go up a level, you're getting a new power. Now, they had this odd thing of substituting powers when you got higher and higher level. You wouldn't have a greater pool of powers. The pool didn't expand. It just kept replacing lesser used or less powerful abilities with ones that you could get at later points. This is odd. The feeling that you are lobotomizing yourself of an ability that you had access to because you needed to replace it with another one. There's a certain economy to replacing, but I never really liked it thematically. It just doesn't make sense to me. Why would you limit yourself? Why would you disgorge abilities that you have used that have gotten you to a certain point because something newer and a little bit hotter comes along? I didn't care for that approach much. But it did mean that you wouldn't be overwhelmed with having to look at 30 different abilities or spells every time you got into an encounter. And encounters were the thing. Now, I'll agree that, yeah, for some, the comparison to multiplayer online role-playing games is pretty valid. I'm not saying that's purely the motivating factor, but it clearly would be seen to scratch the itch of those kind of people. And since there were 10 million people playing World of Warcraft at the time, it didn't hurt to have, something that kind of beckoned to those people. Also, the idea of cool-offs and timers. Wow, I get this ability back as soon as the fight is over, so I just wait for the cooldown, the battle to be over, and I got this power back. The dailies are the things that you really hold on to and budget. So that, yeah, I'm not getting that back until a full day has passed, so I'm only going to use it for the absolute most critical time. And if I use it early, I better hope that I'm not wanting it later, when I really need to do something awesome. So that was kind of odd. It was different. And honestly, I've never seen any other game since, or before that, try to use exactly that approach. I think we don't like that cut and dried magic being bottled up and labeled in that fashion. I'm not a huge fan of that. I like my items to have a little bit more mystery and wonder to them. Also, reading through the book, another thing that you find out quite quickly is that there are almost no abilities or powers that have anything to do outside of a combat. There are a few, very few, but almost all of them are about the encounter. Why? Because 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons is about the encounter. That's it. Everything else is role-playing, and we've been doing that forever. There's a little bit of new stuff with skill challenges, and that was not all that popular, quite honestly. Interesting idea, one that I'm not opposed to, and honestly have used outside of 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Solving a problem that doesn't relate to an encounter in combat by just letting people take their own shot at the problem and rolling a die and seeing if you get more successes than failures. Sure, that can work, and that's fine. It's kind of simplistic when you have to tick off boxes in order to progress, but okay, fine. But 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons was not like Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Basic Dungeons & Dragons, 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons, 3rd edition. It wasn't. It was a completely different creature because it is not about an entire role-playing experience. It is about running encounters, individual segmented challenges for your heroes to use all their cool abilities to overcome. And for your heroes to work together and synergize so that nobody is overtaxed and killed, so that you can all work together to get to the end. And the group is stronger than anyone by themselves, and yeah, by working together you get through these challenges. That's what encounters were designed around. And that's the foundation of 4th edition. Now, I've said this before. If you had not called 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, you'd instead called it Dungeons & Dragons Tactics and launched this as its own sideline, I think it could have done quite well. I think the mechanics for it are fine. But that was it. Almost all the other world building involving magic, gone. And dramatically gone. They actually changed the lore of worlds to fit this new edition. What they did to Faerun, ooh, you thought the Time of Troubles was brutal. Oof. No. 4th edition was absolutely catastrophic. They turned poor Elminster into just a babbling wreck because his magic was just gone. All of his cool stuff, a lot of the stuff was just shredded, and it was hard to read at some points. It was like some sort of weird revenge fantasy. But even something like the spell Teleport. If you get access to the spell Teleport in Dungeons & Dragons, you are awesome. You're instantly a rock star because there's no boundaries for you anymore. You can go anywhere. As long as you have the vaguest, faintest idea of where something is, you can make an attempt and go there. And if you've been there before, even better. You can go back to any point you've been to. So poof, you're gone. Day tripping in the big city, then poof, you're back to where your friends are huddled in an ice cave up on a mountain range. You're like, oh, I brought back some gear for us all. Yay! You know, that was a cool spell. Gone. gone in 4th edition. You can't teleport anymore. There is a spell called Teleportation Circle, where if you go to a particular circle, cast a spell, you can, if you know the other locations of teleportation circles, you can go great distances magically instantaneously, but that's a bit more of a challenge than just cast a spell, poof, I'm gone. So that's a different style by design. This is all by design. This isn't an accident. That is baked right into the DNA of 4th edition, too. Now, I appreciate a tactical challenge. I really do. Combat is not the most important thing in my games. I definitely favor a more narrative approach when I'm running the kind of game that I want to run. But every once in a while, sometimes it's nice to break out a dungeon crawl, like I'm doing with my players right now, teaching them dungeon delving experiences and lessons that are hard to learn other ways. Even reading about them or watching a video about them doesn't teach you those experiences. Losing a character to a trap? That'll teach you some caution. Getting your character ambushed by a spider dropping from the ceiling because nobody thought to look up and nobody is getting dice rolls for perception to see if you see the spider sneaking up on you? That'll learn you to be paranoid about what's above you. So those are lessons that will help you in a variety of games, not just old school games. But in 4th edition, it was all about combat. Almost all of your abilities are focused on combat. Or some support around combat, but very few things really related to skill challenges, which is the only other mechanical thing that they really had in 4th edition. So, yeah, it doesn't mean your characters weren't traveling to other areas and didn't have encounters or couldn't do exploration and dungeon delving. Sure you could. But it really didn't support that as much of a feature at all. It was all about setting up combat encounters. And the setting up is important, too. Because it wasn't about, a wandering monster comes along, roll for initiative, we'll set this up. No. No. Combats were staged. Combats were designed, and they encouraged you to think about ways of making the encounters specifically challenge the player characters. For instance, a fight in a cave with a group of hobgoblins can be challenging. On the other hand, if the hobgoblins are in their lair, they would set up traps. So your players are going to have to deal with those traps. They might have different environments. This is Magic. Say hello, Magic. Yes, Magic is very happy to be here. But they will have challenges that will help them win and make the fight more challenging for your players. And that's a good thing, because it makes the fights more memorable and more difficult, so the players have to use those tactics. They have to use those big brains and all those special abilities to try to win. That is very much a 4th edition thing. I'm not saying that you don't have that dedication to encounters, details, and challenge in 5th edition or 3rd edition. You certainly do. But a lot of the attention and care that they wanted you to go through in 4th edition was akin to the kind of level of focus and attention to detail that you'd be expected to show for the Room of the Big Bad Evil Guy in many other campaigns. Really focusing on different multi-tiered levels of defense and challenges of having artillery in certain areas and then having minions to harass, harry, and use up your group's resources, while you'd have brutes that would absorb a lot of punishment and strikers. And it really broke down the encounters into a science, which actually was good. Again, something that I appreciate in 4th edition. Understanding what roles all these different characters have and how to use them to complement each other. It actually can be a pretty good masterclass in encounter design. But all they had were their encounters. And that really was one of those things that 4th edition kind of got hung up on. It was all about encounter by encounter by encounter. Then, of course, the major thing I think that really, really rankled people was that they made it the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Well, like I said, Dungeons & Dragons Tactics might have been fine. No problem. It would have been a good little war game. Encounter by encounter going through the dungeon. It felt very much like a round of Dungeon Bowl. If you played Blood Bowl, the fantasy American football, but with orcs and dwarves and humans, that was basically distilled down to Dungeon Bowl, which was an expansion that you could have where you could play in dungeons and have to get chests and find the prize that you would try to take in for a touchdown. Lots of traps, lots of tactics like bottling up hallways and stopping your opponents from getting through. Smaller teams, because it was played in a smaller, more intimate area. Yeah, it was a little different, and may not have been quite as satisfying for some people as a full Blood Bowl pitch, but it was something different. But it didn't try to say it's the new Blood Bowl. It's just a different way of playing it. This was the new version of Dungeons & Dragons. This was what Wizards of the Coast was supporting, and not a backwards thought for 3rd and 3.5 edition did they make. So yeah, a lot of people really were pretty bitter about that. They lost a lot of players when they did that, and who was just standing there ready to scoop them all up? Paizo with their new Pathfinder game. And Pathfinder was a absolute juggernaut in the role-playing game field, challenging Wizards of the Coast, ironically. They created that bugbear for themselves. So, now I'm not a Pathfinder guy. I've never played Pathfinder outside of 1 or 2 small games at a con. I understand it pretty well, and I do have the books now, but it's 3.5, and I didn't care for 3.5 all that much, except for the opening. But I did love their adventures, reading through them. The Pathfinder initial paths that I read, which they carried on with my subscription by giving me a few of those, worked out pretty well. Magic is trying to help be my video director, but she's not doing a very good job. I apologize if that kind of messes with the quality, but she really loves rubbing against my camera base. So anyhow, you can probably hear her too. Yes. You're so happy when you're causing mischief. Anyhow, so I'm trying to fight against her pushing it around. So, a lot of people really hated that they switched from the Dungeons and Dragons that they'd appreciated, and some of whom only came in at 3rd edition. This doesn't even have anything to do with the grognards who played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of people were really upset that Wizards of the Coast decided that this was what Dungeons and Dragons was going to be. No more 3rd edition, no more 3.5, it's 4th edition, that's all they're supporting. Of course, they also kind of tweaked their open gaming license a bit, but let's face it, people weren't all that interested. There was still 3.5 stuff coming out well into the lifespan of 4th edition, and then as far as I know, there's still some 3.5 material still coming out from time to time, mostly in modules and things, but still, it was... Wizards had some PR nightmares along the way. They didn't carry through with their promise for a digital play area. That didn't happen. They also, as far as I know, didn't come through with their promise that if you bought a copy of the book, you would also have access to a digital copy. Yeah, that didn't happen either. So, without those things, there was some feelings of betrayal that went on from people like me who rushed out and bought the books on day 1. That was not a cheap pack of books to get either. So, still, we got them. And of course, we look through the player's handbook and there's a few omissions here. The number of classes that are available it's not complete. We're used to a lot more classes, and your race options just gave you access to a few extra powers. This did not feel like it in a significant way really gave us a feel for what we had experienced with all the selection that was possible in 3rd edition. And really, it kind of felt to some, myself included, a little bit like if you've played The Sims, EA's juggernaut. With The Sims, you could go to, say, I don't know, Goodwill, and you'll probably find like 3 or 4 discs of The Sims, one of their expansions, lying around in their bins. And you get it home and you play it and you like it. Say you like it quite a bit. So you go around and you keep hitting, like thrift stores and stuff, or maybe eBay, and you get some of the back episodes, and they're like $3 an expansion or so. Or if you go way back, they had complete sets of The Sims 1 and 2 where it had all the expansions and stuff. Pretty cool and a really great savings. So if you're like me, I kind of got into playing Sims 3. And, I was able to find many of the expansions in thrift stores. I didn't have to pay full price for a lot of that stuff. So it didn't really kill me to pay $2 or $3 and get access to Sims Pets or Sims Island Life. But that's great. Then you come to the next Sims, Sims 4. Go get the basic set right now. I dare you. You get the first set. And it's pretty. The graphics are nice. But you can't do anything. The game has ripped out most of the content because they're going to parcel it all off as they go and sell it to you in expansions. So they're going to charge you, at least they did charge $50 at first for the full game. I'm sure they probably made different price breaks on that. They might even have one now. But the initial price was $50, the usual cost of a complete game. And instead they're at $30 expansion pack here, $30 expansion pack, a $15 stuff pack. It's revolting. To me, it's awful, especially since most of this content was some of it was even included with a basic set before. Now every little thing has to be added to bring you close to the experience that you had with other sets. That's a lot of what 4th edition really seemed to be, with the character selection and some of the gear selection and stuff. It just felt like there's going to be more added to it as a sort of DLC. And really, a Player's Handbook 2 and a Player's Handbook 3 came out that did exactly that, giving you back some of the classes you were familiar with, as well as different takes on the classes or different things that, some interesting ideas, certainly. And then they came out with the Psionics book that added some more Psionic classes. They came out with the Heroes of the Shadow that let you have a class where you could be a vampire as a class. It was just full of stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of DLC-like stuff that they kept expanding, selling the books. I'm sure they made some money on this stuff. But I also saw a lot of that stuff sitting unused on the shelves. I think the D&D community got pretty tired of the way the 4th edition was treating the player base as cash machines to be wrung out. If you want more of that full expansion that you were used to, we're going to have more stuff. Now another thing, I've touched on how abilities worked in the different classes. Part of the reason why some of these books existed as hardcovers at all with a decent amount of thickness was you needed, if you go to, say, 5th edition, you look at the cleric class. It covers 3 pages. 2 of those are pretty much dominated by the domains and all the stuff there. Actually, let's say the cleric is not a great example. Say monk. Monk covers 3 classes. Your basic one for your the class feature list, level up abilities, a brief primer on the class, some suggestions on how to play it, and then the different subclasses of monk and the different abilities. All right there. You needed 20 to 25 pages to cover all of the different abilities and powers, level by level, that you had to choose from for each class in these books. Which was a lot, a lot of ink that went onto a lot of pages to fill out these books. So if you're looking at the Warlock, for instance, in 5th edition, that's 3 pages long. The Warlock in 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons is about 25 pages long. So there's a reason they only had so many classes per book. And they came out with Player's Edition 3, Player's Handbook 4, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then a bunch of other ones that added even more stuff. When you actually went through the process of leveling, it actually wasn't all that painful, because you would have access to just like 2 or 3 abilities that you choose from. You pick one, a la carte, just, that's what I'm taking, and you're good. Wasn't all that hard. Roll some more hit points. Good. Leveling? you're good. Most of the stuff was your level or half your level plus this, so you would bump up some of those numbers by +1 across the board. What this meant rather nakedly is that your character never got more powerful. Not if you were going on a relative scale. You'd add an extra +1, all your monsters would add an extra +1. So your extra +1 that you'd get to hit, all the monsters' armor class has gone up by 1 if you're fighting level appropriate creatures. It's formulaic, and that's part of kind of demystifying the Dungeons & Dragons experience if you show that nakedly how the mechanics all work. As you level up, your monsters level up, and that's just how you expect that to work. But there, they just showed it right out in front of you. So, yeah, there's a fair amount of criticism to that. Justifiable. But on the other hand, as I said, a master class in teaching you how to set up an encounter, a lot of really good ideas, and every kind of pre-made material generally had a good idea of a programmed challenge for the players for each encounter. It took away some of the license of the game master, although you could always tweak it, of course, you're the game master. But it really tried to put it in easy mode to make it easy to set up and run these encounters. I think that somebody who started out on 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons would probably have pretty memorable, well thought out, scripted encounters for the players that play under them. Even if they're not playing 4th edition anymore, you learn how to set up encounters really well in 4th edition. I think that some of the ideas they had for monsters was pretty good. Like, okay, it's a kobold. That doesn't necessarily mean it has 4 hit points. It could be a dragon scale kobold, which has a shield, and they are tough little suckers. They may have the common ability kobolds have of shifting all over the battlefield, making them a nuisance, but they also have some abilities where they may actually be a threat to a higher level party. Not the highest level, but 10th level players can be challenged by kobolds, not just because they're sneaky, but because they actually have some champions that are tough. So I didn't think that was necessarily a bad idea, although 3rd edition taught us how to add levels to monsters and make them tougher. So we were kind of doing that already. In 4th edition, it was just cut up and packaged for you. Okay, players are a 4th level. Don't throw basic kobold minions, or include some kobold minions, but throw a dragon scale and a worm priest kobold, and you could really dress up some of those encounters differently without having to mix and match different monsters together. You could have a fairly solid threat with just the kobolds, or just orcs, or whatever. So that wasn't such a bad thing. I thought some of the classes were actually pretty good. The ones that are basically like 3rd edition classes, they were fine, but I liked some, like the Warden, where he would actually be the ultimate battlefield commander, and he would actually call on other people to use their abilities at the tactically appropriate time. He's in a better position to hurt somebody that I can't get to at the moment. You, hit him. That's my turn, allowing them to hit somebody else. That means that it's a level of battlefield control that I've never seen a martial class mirror, and I really wish they would have had a better way of putting that into 5th edition, although that's a logistical nightmare. I thought that was a really cool idea for a class, for somebody who is kind of selfless, not always wanting to do the cool thing themselves, but allowing other people to do really cool things, which is why I think it was the best GM NPC class ever. When I ran it, I found it was pretty easy to do. Again, a lot of their work had already been done for you if you were running anything pre-published, but I didn't. Very quickly I went into creating my own encounters, and I found it wasn't very hard to do. And honestly, my style kind of drifted more towards more narrative style, so I eschewed some of the hard numbers and things and kind of started fudging things into a blend between 3.5 and 4th edition. It wasn't hard. It wasn't very difficult at all. A lot of it did lean on NPCs doing some of those things, and the players could just focus on their dungeon delving skills and combat, but it worked out all right. I'm not going to say it was all that terrible. But my players really lost their enthusiasm. They didn't appreciate 4th edition. Whether that was because of outside influence and them hearing that this edition was trash, or they just genuinely didn't like the feel of it, I couldn't tell you. I could talk to a couple of them and ask them themselves. And I'm pretty sure one of them would say it wasn't that bad. But what they liked about it was, getting together with their friends and playing, not about being in love with the system. I'm more of a system guy, and if the system itself has problems, I'll call out the problems, but I'll also try to work towards the strengths. My group did not want to continue the 4th edition for too terribly long. I think we got up to like 4th or 5th level before they made the conscious effort that we weren't going to do it anymore. And as a DM, you need to do what your players say if you want to keep your group going. If they're not going to play a game, then you've got to stop and do something else. And we did. And the game was the game ended prematurely. I have collected a few more 4th edition books since, never ran it, but it was always good reading to kind of see the mindset behind some of the ideas that they had, and to kind of see how they could take Dungeons and Dragons in a different direction. It's just unfortunate that it was so catastrophic in the way they did it, kind of ham-fisted, and with a lot of promise left on the table that just never materialized. But I still don't hate it, even though, like I said, it ended a campaign idea that I had. Would it have been a great one under a different edition? Maybe it would have. But I think with 4th edition, it's a little bit demonized far beyond its actual deserving of being demonized. And quite honestly, these days, you can get a ton of 4th edition stuff for very cheap. People were just dumping that stuff off. And I remember one time I saw for a $50 lot, you could get the core 3 books, and I think they had like 5 other solid hardcover books, and a variety of packs for just $50. It's insane. Retail price for all that would have been over $300. But, like I said, my library got swollen a little bit with some of this extra stuff. I'm not really that bitter about it. And would I run 4th edition again? I might do a one-shot, just to introduce people to what 4th edition was like, to archive it. But do I prefer 5th edition? Oh, goodness, yes. Oh, goodness, yes. This is not a completely deep dive into the mechanics either of 4th edition. It isn't a proper review. This is just me thinking about, how it affected me, what my actual thoughts were, so that when I actually say 4th edition wasn't all that bad, you guys kind of know what I'm talking about. But anyhow, I'm Rob. Thank you very much for joining me, and until next time, wherever magic is, you can say goodbye to. But thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time. Thank you and farewell.